We knew that Ole Miss's defense and defensive front were really, really strong. Is the fact that they got such a push against Georgia a compliment to Ole Miss, or are we walking away with this with more questions about Georgia?
I think it's a compliment to Ole Miss, but it's also a reflection of the injuries that Georgia has suffered on its offensive line. But I mean, that's why Ole Miss went in the portal and got those guys. That's why you go get Walter Nolan, is
Walter
because they,
Nolan with the yeah.
yeah, like you knew the last few years, the biggest difference between you and those teams was your defensive line, just your team typically in the trenches. You knew you had to get stronger there to have a chance to compete in these games. They did, and it paid off today, quite literally, I guess. So, I mean, it's just like Georgia couldn't do anything. They could not run the ball at all. They had 1.8 yards per carry. And even if you take out the sack yardage, it was only 3.5. They had 9 tackles for loss. They had 5 sacks. They made life absolutely hell. And we talked in the big game breakdown that under pressure, Carson Beck had been awful this year. They got a ton of pressure on him, and he played awful in this game. I mean, overall, he didn't have the same amount of turnovers that he'd had in recent weeks, but he didn't look good. I mean, he was 20 of 31 for 186 yards with no touchdowns and the interception. It was just a completely rattled performance from Georgia, and it's all because Ole Miss just went out there and kicked their butts for the most part.
Ole Miss looked like they had a different gear than Georgia, and that rarely happens to Georgia in a big game. So I think you got to give Ole Miss credit for rising to the moment, and Georgia, some level of demerit for failing to meet the moment, right? But they were ready for it. I always think it's hard to rush the passer in the rain. It's because I noticed that I like to bet mobile quarterbacks in the rain. Like if it's slippery, I'm like perfect
elusiveness.
Yeah, I think it's hard to start stop and just I don't know. It's a pet theory of mine. I like doing it, but didn't seem that affected by the rain. Ole Miss. Now, I know Carson Beck's not mobile, and you kind of know where he is. So you can tee off, but in Tom's point about the lack of a run game, that was huge. It wasn't like they were that close to stopping a bunch of big ones either.
No,
their long run of the day was 12 by a receiver, Dylan Bell. What was their long bat? We just had up on the screen. What was their long carry of the day by a running back?
it was
Frazier, right?
It was 8 yards by Frazier.
Yeah,
8 yards
twice.
What was your favorite yard of those 8? I mean,
I loved the third one. I just thought the step he took was just majestic.
And
you got to
look,
credit Ole Miss, man. Like showed up in a big game.
That's
huge.
You got to credit Lane Kiffin. I mean, that is such a low hanging fruit, like discussions outside of our Cover 3 podcast world. Like if you were listening to a national radio program on Friday afternoon and they were making the hosts just run through college football, those hosts are going to be like, can Lane Kiffin win the big one? The guy always falls short. He can't win the big one. And look, Lane Kiffin just won a big one.
I said that every freaking week. Whenever Ole Miss is playing a big one, I always pick against him until he wins a big one.
Okay, here's a question for you. What is bigger, the improvement gap for Ole Miss from last year to this year, or the backslide from Georgia from last year to this year?
I would say the improvement gap, although maybe not by much. I think that the injuries on the offensive line have impacted them, but I still think it's not just that. But I also think, honestly, we've talked about parity. I wonder if in the SEC, if it's not as much parity as much as it's now that there are no divisions, these teams actually have to play each other in the regular season. But I do think that the improvement because I mean, it'd be one thing if Ole Miss had just beaten Georgia today, skin of their teeth, home win, get it done, gritty. But I mean, they just completely outplayed Georgia. So even if Georgia has gone bad, it's like Ole Miss compared to what we have seen from them in these games before, just looks like a completely different team. Like you said, they had a different gear that we typically haven't seen from them before. So I would give them the credit here as far as who's the difference.
Chip?
Oh, Carson Beck, negative impact.
Yeah.
That Carson Beck goes from, look at this guy who we think has a really bright future. He's got a lot of skills. His tape looks good to over the course of the last what is it, like now 5 or 6
It's been like
games?
6 games where
Yeah,
he's just
Like,
been on a turnover binge.
right, you're a negative impact on your team's ability to go and win football games. Look, I agree that there is something about an Ole Miss breakthrough that deserves 100% credit. And I think that I'm going to be looking at Ole Miss differently because this is a team that with this win, enters the bigger conversations. And when I think about them in the bigger conversations, when they show up in the social graphics of a bracket, like graphic bracket, like when they show up in a graphic bracket, you're going to be like, yeah, you know what? I could see Ole Miss winning a playoff game. I could see this being a team that could be really dangerous that you don't want to face in a postseason elimination type scenario. Like I feel very differently about that here on Saturday night than I felt on Saturday morning. But to assign blame and credit both ways, I do think this is a continuation of the offensive shortcomings of the Georgia Bulldogs, which are not just on Carson Beck, but certainly a part of Carson Beck, because the best win that Georgia had this year, all of their points, except for one admittedly very important drive, came on short fields thanks to that defense. So I don't know what to do with that other than say this is a continuation of the fact that offensively, Georgia just ain't got it.
What if Georgia's schedule last year was super easy?
Oh, I know. I get that.
What if they're not much worse than they were last year?
They still kicked some ass though. They had a gear that they haven't even really been able to hit all that often this year.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but last year they caught. I mean, they struggled with Missouri a little bit, but not much. Kentucky was whatever, I guess. Florida was a disaster. Vandy was pretty bad. Vandy. Auburn was bad. UAB was bad. South Carolina, no offensive line at all last year. Ball State, UT Martin. They caught Ole Miss when they were super injured last year. Remember? Because was it Jeremy James? Somebody broke their foot in practice on that Tuesday last year as well. Remember that? And it was like, oh god, like they're out of, like just like we talked about Georgia's. Like you're out of bullets. You're pulling the trigger, ain't nothing coming out. Like clip's empty. And then they beat Tennessee. That was a good win, I thought. Like 38-10. I know it was a Joe Milton Tennessee team, but what if Georgia is just about as good as they were last year? They just actually are playing decent teams this year.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think they're worse. I think last year's Georgia team would beat this year's Georgia team. And
like by a lot? Or you just like you'd be confident in picking them?
I would just be confident in picking last year's Georgia team over this year's Georgia team. I mean, trace it all the way back to Kentucky. This is just.
Is it a leadership thing too?
I'm not ready. I haven't done enough forensic investigation to draw those kind of allegations at this point for a team that still has so much damn talent. But
what if Dan Lanning was the secret sauce? I'm just throwing that out there for clicks.
I don't know, man. You spent all that time talking Gladiator. It sure seemed like you let those turtles run a little wild.
Covering the first half though, did you, Dan?
Yeah, so look, here's the deal. They've got 2 losses. They've got Tennessee up next. They've got UMass. They've got Georgia Tech. If the Georgia Bulldogs finish the season at 10-2, they will be in conversations, and they have a win against Texas. And as long as Texas continues to win, that win will look good. Later in the show, we're going to do AP Top 25 projections as well. We're going to package in that sort of general college football playoff implications. So we'll try to keep it just sort of like team and game analysis at this point. But there's still an opportunity for Georgia to do things that it wanted to do at the start of the season. I'm just less confident in that team being able to accomplish those goals as we continue to get more data for a team that is not the world beaters that I think we expected.
Yeah, there's absolutely no more margin of error left for a team that's committed a lot of errors lately.
Yeah.
Like we think if Georgia loses again, they're out type thing?
I don't know if they're out because
I would say regular season loss, I think they're out.
Yeah,
like non-regular season Atlanta, loss, like an SC title game, if they make it, would not be.
Like if they lose to Tennessee, what, next week?
Yep.
I think they're probably done.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Because that would also be a great win for Tennessee and just kind of like cement
now
their status.
suddenly you've got multiple losses to the other teams you're going to be competing for that at-large spot with.
Right. That those head-to-head results are going to end up being impactful. Also, I was like running through all the SEC scenarios today, and I remember back in like July, Tom was like, I've talked myself into Tennessee to the point where I've got Texas and Tennessee playing for the SEC title. And damn, if Texas and Tennessee aren't in a position to both play their way into the SEC championship game, we'll see.
Well,